Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. I'm Craig, and today we are recording in the inimitable Dome. And with me, I have our guest. His name is Ben Decarie. He is from Penn State University, and he is a graduate student, and he's quickly becoming a friend of mine. We met under some very unusual circumstances where we were both in a workshop on Mark Fisher's work on hauntology. And here I come with all of my notes on aeonic time, chronological time, the work of Deleuze and Mark Fisher. But I was sitting in the room with somebody who's working on this particular topic in their work right now. And it's because of that the seal was broken. And now Ben and my friendship is now burgeoning. And so, Ben, I want to welcome you to Acid Horizon and tell us about who you are and your work.
Well, thank you so much, Craig, for having me in this, welcoming me basically into your home and in this amazing dome of yours. I'm very impressed by it. So my work, who I am, I'm a PhD student here at Penn State. I'm working mostly in concepts like deep time, eco-phenomenology, trying to sort of get a sort of access to true lived experience, to certain understandings of nature. Mm-hmm. Those are still questions for me, no answer yet. So that's sort of where I'm going. Per se, I'm not like a Deleuzian. I don't come from a Deleuzian background. Deleuze was sort of like something that I finally picked up. I was trained mostly in phenomenology so far, worked a lot on Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty, who's got a great corpus on nature and the problem of nature. So that's sort of what got me into there. But most importantly, what truly animates me in those questions are questions of metaphysics and the role of sort of the emergence of lived experience within nature. Mm-hmm. Those are questions that kind of haunt me, will keep haunting me for a while, I think. Sure. So happy to discuss those things with you today.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that we want to talk about is the relationship of time to ecological crisis. And Ben and I both are off of a 2-day workshop on time, waste, and extinction. And so I was able to hear his paper, which will become a video on the Acid Horizon channel at some point. And I think the first thing that we should do is explain Deleuze to the masses, which is always something that the people want, and particularly his concept of time. And you are looking at difference in repetition as a way to sort of extrapolate this your basic reading of Deleuze on time. So let's begin there. What is the first, the second, and third synthesis in Deleuze's work?
What is going on with time in Deleuze, right? No, definitely that's sort of something that gets somewhat overlooked in Deleuze these days, in Deleuze scholarship. But I really think that it's sort of the core of what Deleuze attempted to do as he tried to rebuild or basically give his own sort of take on metaphysics, was this second chapter of difference in repetition for itself. So what's happening in there? Of course, Deleuze is sort of post-Copernican revolution in this Kantian sort of motion where there's a whole critique of this possibility of having an objective time that would be sort of all-encompassing, and that would be basically the locus in which creatures, human beings, everything in the world sort of just evolve in, right? So objective time is this sort of model of temporality in which subjects are born and die into this sort of world that pre-exists as a sort of master clock that just keeps on expanding for infinity, right? And then there was Kant, who appeared at some point and was like, no, time must be something of subjectivity. Subject is the one who projects the form of time on experience, and time sort of comes from this sort of intimate experience of the world. So there's a sort of constitution and a genesis of time through subjectivity. Of course, Deleuze is clearly of this sort of divide on the concept of time, which is basically him saying like, time is clearly something that emerges with the subject. It's not something that pre-exists. There is a constitution of time that happens. However, he's sort of in another sort of philosophical inheritance that comes with philosophers like from the French spiritualist tradition, like Condillac, Mendebiran, and then eventually Bergson, who comes with this concept of duration, and eventually Husserl. So there's a whole sort of phenomenological, vitalist genesis there in Deleuze's concept of time. And what is important for those philosophers is that they all understand the genesis of time or the constitution of time not as something that is projected by a preformed subject on the world, but as something that is sort of co-originary with the subject. So there's a subjectivity that sort of gets formed, and at the same time that subjectivity is formed, there's a formation of time at the same time. So it's simultaneous, and being born is making time be born. So there's this sort of interplay there. So genesis of time, genesis of subjectivity being those events that happen simultaneously. But okay, so we're there with Deleuze. Deleuze is clearly doing that. But what remains sort of bugging there is, even though those traditions that attempt to trace sort of this co-originarity of time and subjectivity, even though they sort of don't presuppose a subject in order to have time, they also sort of keep the human subject as this sort of culmination of time. The human subject is sort of the one who has accomplished time. And now, as a community of human subjects, we can be like these people who have clocks and have this sort of build temporality. I think that Deleuze is the one who, for me, made possible to think a philosophy of constitution of time that is on the side of subjectivity, but that doesn't require necessarily a sort of anthropomorphic human being or an anthropomorphic subjectivity in order for time to sort of unfurl.
I see.
So in philosophy that tries to understand the passage of nature, that tries to understand sort of a subjective life of the forest, for instance, you sort of need to, and if you want to remain sort of on this side of the Copernican revolution, you need to sort of find the loopholes that allow you to think the constitution of time with the constitution of subjectivity without having the human being being this sort of accomplishment of time.
One of the things that's important to unpacking all of this is understand the distinctions that Deleuze makes between present, past, and future. Where there's a conventional understanding of those terms that when, under the lens of philosophical scrutiny, things begin to break down, and Deleuze, and like many other philosophers, is forced to make an account how notions of past, present, and future interpenetrate one another. So let's talk about the first synthesis, the present. How does the present work in Deleuze's terms?
Yeah, of course. So that's like that's the main problem, right? It's sort of how do we make the present pass, and how does that happen? And I think that when we talk about like non-anthropomorphic vision of what time constitution could look like, I think that the synthesis of the present is the one that is the most helpful. So yeah, let's look into that. Basically, the first synthesis of time, it starts with how does an instant is registered. Deleuze is very much upfront about it. His sort of hero or philosophical model on which he models the first synthesis of time is David Hume. It all starts with the registering of a change or a difference into terms that repeat. So we got difference and repetition right there. What is a difference? What is a repetition? It's two sounds. Beep, beep. Those two sounds. So there's a term that repeated itself. And the second time I repeated it, it was different than the first one. That's the constitution of the living present for Deleuze. But it's not by itself. So those are not sounds that by themselves accomplish the synthesis of the present. What I'm trying to say here is that those sounds could exist without any contemplation that would be there to witness them. And there would be sounds, but there would not be a passage. There would not be an instant. So what is required to have this passage, this instant, to have a living present there? Well, those two sounds, they're originally indifferent and unknown to time. Their change is not taking place in any kind of temporality prior to them being captured with or by a contemplation. But what is a contemplation? That's like what counts as a contemplation. That's the big problem. So in Hume's mind, it's a contemplating mind that is required for a change to be registered across the repetitions of an object. So if you can quote your difference of repetition, Deleuze says, repetition changes nothing in the object repeated, but does change something in the mind which contemplates it. So what is happening? The terms, the sounds, the beep beep, they're unchanged by the repetition. From the A to the B, they're indifferent to change. They're just passing. They're not even passing yet. What is changed is the mind that receives them, because this mind is perceiving a change. And then this mind can contract those two terms into an instant. And that's how we get melodies, for instance.
Can I stop you for one moment? So I want to interrogate Deleuze's idea of contemplation. Because in other places, Deleuze says that the activity of philosophy itself is not a contemplation. However, we can contemplate, you and I can contemplate an amoeba that's, expelling its waste is a kind of contemplation. Absolutely. The leaf falling from the tree is a kind of contemplation. In very certain terms, like what does Deleuze mean by contemplation in that sense?
Great question, especially since I really like that you bring up this idea that philosophy is not contemplation. Why is that? It's because contemplation is passive. Philosophy requires thought, and thought is not passive. So it's a whole other order of magnitude that philosophy is trying to do. And thought is made possible by contemplation, but contemplation is something that happens without any subject, without any volition, without any decision. Contemplation is this contraction of instance that can be either from me just registering what's happening in this beautiful dome right now, me just being there, contemplating while having this sort of vita activa, where I'm like talking to you in thought. And this is sort of, these contemplations of mine form the background of passage of time, on top of which I can now do my activities and talk to you.
Sure. So, I mean, at one level, we can understand that when a being or an object has the capacity to sense. There's a sensate dimension. But how do we think about that in terms of the inorganic world?
That is very interesting, because Deleuze doesn't give an answer for the inorganic world. The closest that we get in Deleuze's difference in repetition in the passage that we're looking at here in Repetition for Itself is a very, I think, wildly overlooked passage in which Deleuze talks about how a contemplation can be accomplished at the monocellular level, thinking, so you were talking about an amoeba, and he basically uses this, how does a cell articulate time in an arrow? So that's what we're trying to do here, is having tiny arrows of time, of little contractions of instants that can build something greater together. But how does a cell do that? Well, Deleuze does, I think, a very fantastic trick of saying, well, the cell has a past, it's heredity, it's DNA. And the cell is striving towards a future, let's say when it's sort of dried up from any sort of moisture or water, and is expressing a need by making itself available to a receptivity of water. So there's an articulation of time here at the organic level, but the very smallest possible organic beings that we could think of are articulating temporality. So the inorganic, great question. And that's sort of where I would like myself in my work, try to like stretch this idea and understand, let's say with like rock formations in cave that get some deposits of calcite through water droplets. Is that a sort of contemplation in itself? So Deleuze doesn't go there. I wish to go there at some point. That would require like maybe talking with geologists.
So then what is the past for Deleuze? That's the second synthesis.
That's the second synthesis.
Or memory, rather, right?
The synthesis of memory, yeah. So synthesis of memory is a little harder to, at least for me, to sort of explain or grasp, because it's the way in which Deleuze frames it is sort of almost like there's something magical about it in a sense. But again, Deleuze doesn't sort of craft something out of a pocket. He brings in Bergson as his hero or model for the past here. And he defines this second synthesis as the constitution of the time that does not pass, but that makes possible the passage of all presence. So it's what makes the present pass, not past. Yeah. So it's sort of the locus in which presents that came to pass are encountered, but this locus itself can never become present. So that's very cryptic, what I just said, and I'm going to try to like make it more instinctive.
Right. I mean, right away, if I were coming to this for the first time, I would be asking, what is the material basis for thinking that? When I think of material, I think of matter. What is the matter of time, or the matter of the past?
That's a very good question. I think that the best way to understand that is signs, language. It's the virtual, basically. Everything that exists between us that is the realm of the invisible, it's stacked somewhere, right?
Right.
It sort of exists, or it floats around matter, and I can say words to you. We're speaking, but I just use those words. They were available to me, but where were they? So that's sort of, so the being of the past is sort of the reservoir in which all of these available fragments of memory are sort of becoming available to us, but in a way that is non-chronological. So that's, and if we want to talk about Aeon a little later, that's sort of where it comes into play. I think that's a way that is helpful to understand that and visualize that is to think about dreams.
Okay. I love thinking about dreams.
We love thinking about dreams. Union. Don't say that. So in a dream, right, the ordering out of time is pretty weird.
Yeah.
So the events of the world that we have sort of been through, that we're able to register and to order through habits and our just like normal, regular existence, all of this is sort of like shuffled into this sort of soup of memory. It sort of just pops there in a way that doesn't make sense chronologically at all. I'm going to have like reminiscence from my childhood at the same time that I like speaking in the voice of this guy I met at the grocery store yesterday. So there's this whole mix and match of memory that are not sort of tethered to any sort of coherent presence, let's say. So everything can suddenly be connected to everything. The ordering of the present, so everything that pertains to the first synthesis, basically, those made possible the fact that I encountered the people that I see in my dreams, or the objects, or the places, and whatnot. But in the dream, which is the sort of locus of the past, the ordering is kind of unmade and shuffled into something totally non-chronological. So it's sort of pure pasts communicating with other pure pasts in very unpredictable way, right? There doesn't seem to be a sort of logic to the dream. Or if there is a logic, we would have to investigate it. And there would be a lot of literature around that, and there has been. So in the same way, also, so dreams can be sort of a good way to see that. But what Deleuze truly uses to make us understand that is involuntary memory. So he's going to talk about it more into the Proust book. Let's say an encounter with something in the world, a Madeleine, for instance, when Proust dips the Madeleine in the coffee and in the tea and is reminiscing of all Combray and everything. So this can make a fragment of pure past rise to the surface, and suddenly you're sort of sort of invaded with all of these sensorial reminiscence that just float around and sort of poison your whole field of perception. So this is also a type of manifestation of the work of the second synthesis, or the notion of an involuntary memory.
Yeah, let me ask a quick question on that. I mean, one of the ways that I had thought about this in the past, it's very Kantian in a way, in the sense that, the way that I think about the memory piece is that it's the condition of the possibility for which an innumerable and differential set of relations is able to register upon something even different than itself. Just unpack that in its way. So like if I brush up against a tree and get some tree sap on me, there's no sign in the sense of the linguistic sense in which I understand a sign to be. However, its sensate impression upon me would then evoke perhaps a whole series of statements, beliefs, values, and what have you, that are a dislocation from the event in some way. But it's in virtue of that disjunction that I'm able to even formulate a statement about it. I mean, how does Deleuze negotiate something like what I'm talking about?
I think that you just described it very, very well, because this is, what does the pure past do? It's meaning. It's us being in a world of meaning, being in a world where the fact that I can scroll on Instagram and have this influencer telling me, live in the present, don't live in the past, and stuff like that. Right. It's because I live in the past all the time. I sort of, there's a layer or sort of a cloak of pastness that is always sort of around me all the time. There's no way that I'm just in this pure feeling of registering the pure presence of what is around me. The fact that I'm talking about this, which is because I read the book. Right. I read the book, and it sort of cloaks our conversation right now, and it's there around us. Another way I was like trying to visualize it the other day, and I think that it might be sort of brain rot, but
this is the place for brain rot. So
it's like, you see like on Wikipedia, all of those like blue links, like every word that is in blue.
Right.
Those are sort of like, they were written at some point on the Wikipedia page, but they all sort of link into this sort of immense mind map of Wikipedia. If we wanted to like link all of those things and just like generate a sort of mind map of all of the connections that you can make on those cross-referencing, basically.
Right.
Like the Wikipedia page would be sort of present.
It's like a surface, essentially, where the virtuality of those connections registers itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you were to generate the mind map, you would like see something like the sort of virtual pure past that makes possible for these things to have a meaning in the first place.
Right.
Because they're connected, they're interlinked, and language functions like that too.
Right.
So, yeah.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get caught up in the soup anymore, let's talk about the future for Deleuze.
Let's talk about the future,
So what does Deleuze say about the third synthesis?
So the third synthesis is fascinating because it's, okay, so how do we exist how do we think about the future usually? Like, let's say wake up today and I woke up this morning and knew I was coming to see you, right?
Right.
So I was sort of like visualizing, like, oh, I have to get breakfast, and like, this is like, I'm going to go to see Craig.
Sure.
We think about the future basically as another modality of the present most of the time. Even when I'm trying to project myself, when we ask children, what are you going to be in 10 years? We sort of ask them to think of themselves in a sort of presence. So what we're asking ourselves to do when we think about the future is basically accomplishing in sort of a provisional way the first synthesis over again, but applying it to the future, right?
Okay.
So we mostly understand future in the present tense as another type of present. And it's okay because we need to organize our lives, right? We need to have plans. But planning is a sort of way to do that. However, the future has a very curious power over us that we don't always realize it has, but when it gets experienced in that way, in this specific third synthesis way, it gets scary. And the third synthesis is a little bit of an existential crisis. Why is it an existential crisis? It's the synthesis that sort of spills the beans of the metaphysics of time itself. It's the synthesis that makes you realize that time is completely contingent and that there could be no time. There could be chaos, basically. It's the synthesis that opens you to chaos. And how does it do that? So it shows basically that without those contemplation contractions that create the pure present, and without this sort of reservoir of pure memory, there is simply a sort of not only other possibilities of presence, like a calendar. Like we think about, and if we want to talk about extinction, we could think of this that way. We could think of, no humans, no animal species, just rocks floating into space forever. And we could still sort of try to apply a calendar there and just be like, 23,000 million years have passed. And that's very scary because we just try to accomplish a first synthesis over and over again on this, but it doesn't register, it doesn't work.
I see.
So that could be one way to do that. But we also, what is revealed basically in the third synthesis is our absolute powerlessness to do that ad infinitum. Is our absolute powerlessness in trying to map the future in the modality of the present. And it's how we're, when we say that we're just passing through, it's sort of realizing that after we pass through, there's the future that awaits is pure chaos that is incommensurable to any type of human meanings that we would try to assign. So it's very, very scary. How does it do that? It's because, nothing necessitates or nothing makes necessary the contemplation contractions in the first place. If nothing in the world necessitates those connections, it means that underneath this sort of like grounding of time that we've established by contemplating, contracting, there's an absolute groundlessness. And that's Deleuze's big, and spoiler alert, who's the model, who's the hero here? It's Nietzsche with the eternal recurrence. So that's the same sort of existential crisis that the eternal recurrence is accomplishing here. The moment where you sort of try to understand or to fathom what it would mean for you to live this same life over and over again. Are you panicked? Yes, because what it reveals is completely chaotic. There's no arrow anymore if everything just returns. There's no articulation of everything. There's no project. There's no projection. It's just a soup of infinity that collapses on your soul and crushes you and makes you realize that you have no bearings on time itself. And that time is not only... It could be like reassuring to think of time as something that sort of, it has us. Time sort of like, it's there, it's our cradle in which we sort of exist. No, you made time and you're alone.
Frightening.
Frightening, yeah.
Well, here's the one thing that when going through this concept through your paper, you talked about the ungroundedness of it all, right? And so in some absolute sense, there is no necessity. I mean, in a relative sense, it seems like there is necessity, like a cause-effect sort of thing, if we want to go back to the Hume piece. The one challenge that I had with it was, how is it that the ungrounding is either, of course we can theorize it, but how do we get from ungrounding to the sense of groundedness? There is a kind of spookiness there in the way that it was articulated in your paper. Like, how is it that we ever can sense the relative stability of a set of conditions in the world? Yeah.
So you mean after we've encountered this?
Once we theorize ground, right? How is it that we can still maintain the sense and knowledge of a relative stability of states of the world?
That's a great question because, as you know, in the first chapter of Difference and Repetition, there's a discussion, and in the third chapter as well, there's a discussion of the simulacrum, and there's a discussion of basically what's underneath those groundings. But in those chapters, he uses a different word than grounding or foundation or fondation. He uses the word masks. because we realize, so it's a way to understand it too, to realize that the third synthesis sort of removes the mask of stable temporality and stable arrow of time to make us realize that all of this is under chaos. We sort of have a brief instant where we gaze into this chaos, but this chaos can never be grasped experientially, can never be recognized. It's unrecognizable. It's purely under your skin. So what do you see when you see this absolute groundlessness? Well, you can sort of recuperate it under different avatars. You can think of it as, it's hell, it's a nightmare, it's horrible. And we will use words that are basically just other masks that we're putting there in order to sort of, even in this very scary moment, even if we encounter it as scary, we're gonna assert new recovering, new effectuations, new masks, new way of recognizing what's going on in there, because it's impossible to not do so. So even in the moment of like pure disruption, there's a sort of, what you see is never the abyss or the pure groundlessness. What you see will always be a mask. It's going to be the mask of a nightmare, the mask of a panic, the mask, all of these words that I'm using to describing the experience. So you'll never see the groundless. You'll always see another mask. What is your power there? Your power is to make a mask that is going to be suitable. So it's about creativity.
And now we're edging up against this notion of ressentiment, and becoming worthy of the event. Acid Horizon has another very short video on this, and I'll probably link that at the end or something so you can take a look at that. But this is where it gets interesting for me, because there's a phenomenological aspect to it, which is this uncovering of the mask, the making apparent of a mask. And that entails the injunction to make evaluation, right? Or to reevaluate. And it's at this point that we run up against also Deleuze's notion of the event. So this is a term that we haven't used yet, but it's in the context of the event that this valuation takes place.
Yes.
Maybe what we should do first, just in case people listening aren't familiar, what is Deleuze's connection to Nietzsche's theory of ressentiment, and how does he articulate it through this notion of time?
So first thing to note, you were talking about the event, and just a quick note on that. The event, it's an sort of ideal content that has different manifestations in the world. That is, I think that, and those are not my terms, those are another commentator, David Lapoujade, in his book from 2014, he said that the event is basically the sort of testimony of the action of the groundless on us. So when the event is sort of felt, when the event resurfaces, what it does is it basically shows us this fragility of the ground. And we have many events. We have climate crisis is an event that is sort of always hovering over our existences, making us realize the fragility of everything that we've built, not only in terms of our calendars or our human project or our history, because everything might collapse, but also everything we've built in terms of like physical things that might just be broken down by tsunamis and stuff. So it revealed the event by its many effectuations in the world, as it hovers over us, will reveal those things. So now, what do we do in face of the event? What do we do in face of the existential crisis? What do we do in face of the third synthesis of time? It's very similar to this aphorism in the gay science, where it's like the little demon that's whispering to you in your ears, what if everything you see, the moon, the branches, everything you've ever done in your life was to start over and over again? So this is the encounter of an event of your own death, basically, that will reveal to you the fragility of everything you've built, everything you think, all of these arrows of temporality that you're shooting in the world. All of this reveals that. And one of the possible response in this aphorism in Nietzsche is, will you be resentful? Will you try to doom the world for the pain that it causes you? And for Nietzsche, the concept of ressentiment, is linked to this sort of hostility toward the event or the encounter. And it's an hostility that is unproductive because it impoverishes you. It's like just chewing stones. It won't lead you anywhere. It's a sort of energy that is unproductive, basically, which is the response to the event or to the encounter or to the existential crisis, to the fragility of time that is incorrect, or like it's a bad response because you're not making yourself worthy of what's happening. Instead, you're resisting in a way that will lead you nowhere. So what do we do there? So that's the big question. And I think that Nietzsche and Deleuze will have very similar responses. And as I was just mentioning, it's about creativity. It's about, for Nietzsche, it's about creating values. There's the amor fati that is in Nietzsche is all about this sort of attempt at not only celebrating the eternal recurrence, but celebrating in a way that will sort of introduce variations in every potential occurrence of this returning. So it's never the same that returns for Nietzsche, even though the succession of events, even though the chronological succession of things in the world are all empirically the same for like a spectator that would look at your life like a movie. It's all the same movie all the time. But if you want to sort of play your existence like an actor, and that's what Deleuze uses as a metaphor, play your existence like an actor means be aware of all of the micro changes and make this eternal recurrence the eternal recurrence of difference, basically, where everything is going to be so introduce variations into it. So it's all about introducing variations, and that sort of overshadows what's coming in Thousand Plateaus, right? With the what is a minor becoming? It's about introducing continuous variations. So the attempt at creativity is this attempt at introducing variations. Now for Deleuze, it doesn't end with trying to live in this sort of very sort of assertive or like this sort of the big yes to life, like Nietzsche wants. For Deleuze, it's also about creation in the writing sense. There's something about tracing back the event, making sense by creating your own masks, using basically this existential crisis as something that will propel writing of a poem, writing of your life, and that writing is going to be the introducing of creative variations in existence.
One of the interesting things that Deleuze talks about in The Logic of Sense, he draws upon a metaphor to describe what resentment looks like. And he uses the metaphor, this is in series 21, I believe. It's the metaphor of the tyrant or the despot who claims victory through war. And in the sort of privatization of the victory, those who've been subjugated or subordinated beneath this tyrant are then, by proxy, they internalize their own wounds, their own sense of hopelessness, valuelessness as a kind of private wound. And I like the sort of private/proprietarian metaphor as a way to describe resentment and ressentiment, because what Deleuze is suggesting is there's a way of getting out from behind that identification with the wound, with the harm, that then exposes us to the multiplicity of forces in the world that are affected by this sort of pervasive violence that is the cosmos. And Deleuze says this is the truly revolutionary way to deal with violence in the world, with one's wound. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the climate and the politics related to extinction and the ways to sort of not only emotionally manage that, but to imagine that politically. Is there a way that you can kind of tie all that back together?
Yeah, I that's a wonderful question. And the best, I think, interlocutor to sort of get into this discussion is definitely Penn State professor Leonard Lawler, who wrote in his 2016 book, From Violence to Speaking Out, wonderful chapter on precisely that, the mortal wound, and the response that it propels or triggers into the wounded soldier. I'm sort of glossing on what he's saying in this chapter, but basically what happens in there is that what happens in the existential crisis, it's a sort of clarity, a vision, the event of my own death, the fact that everything that I've been doing sort of will eventually just fall into oblivion, that hovers and that sort of presents itself, it comes to the surface and I can see it now. So it's about clarity and vision. That's why the third synthesis is productive, because it makes this sort of ideal content that was formless and that was affecting me without my knowing, it makes it accessible to me in a moment of clarity and understanding. I don't see the groundlessness itself. I see masks, but nonetheless, I see the fragility and I see what is going on. So I have clarity. So Lawler in his book talks about this passage of series 21, in which it's a discussion of Joey Bousquet, the poet, who talked about his mortal wound on the battlefield. And what is happening here? What you see, what comes to the surface, it's war. You see war. The wound of Joey Bousquet, because he starts writing about it, because he engages in this, what Deleuze will call a counter-effectuation of the event, which means sort of seeing the secret of the event and sort of revealing the secret of the event for what it is in this sort of clarity or vision. The soldier, by writing about the wound, by inhabiting the wound, gives this sort of archive, this sort of legacy in which he can talk about war for what it is. It makes him capable of seeing through the bullshit of the tyrant, basically.
Yeah.
It is my wound. It's not, it's my wound, it's my body that is wounded, yet it's the wound of the war. It's a collective wound that is the expression of all of these forces that for now I can see all at once, all converging into that inscription of the event in the flesh. So the event has been effectuated in my flesh in a way that's going to destroy my body.
Right.
Yet I bear these traces, this trace of the event that sort of contains it in its full power. And because I have it within my body, I can sort of reveal its secret. So there's a sort of an encounter with the event like this that disrupts, that accomplishes the third synthesis of time. If there's possibility of resentment, like you were saying, my private wound, I'm just dying, it's horrible.
Right.
And it's my fault too. It's me who should not have been like at this.
I should have done something sooner about this.
Yeah,
I shouldn't have gotten into this war. Should have protested earlier.
Exactly. Or I should have saved my friend instead. Or all of these like possible sort of recuperation of the wound into resentment.
Right.
Or just resignation. I'm just gonna let myself die completely without effectuating the counter-effectuation. That is the productivity, that is the creativity, that is the legacy. That's because I was sort of endowed with a clear vision that Deleuze would never use that terminology, but I'm just using it for fun. I sort of have this duty to carry it on in creation. So and that's what Lawler is also trying to do, is sort of like getting out of their sort of ethics of the counter-effectuation, this sort of responsibility towards the event, toward what are we endowed with when we receive this moment of clarity, when we encounter it, when the event becomes available to us in a vision. So we have to counter-effectuate it, and this has to culminate into an archive, into writing.
And so this brings us to, I think, a profoundly useful way of using Deleuze's work to think through the exigency of crisis right now with climate change and the imminent extinction of all species on the planet. We don't need to review the data on that. But one thing that's interesting in your paper, and I mean, Deleuze, of course, brings it up in The Logic of Sense, is, we walk this narrow path. On one side, there's resentment as it's classically understood. There's resignation, which Deleuze says could be another face of resentment, right?
Yep.
And the prospect of having one of these moments of rupture and clarity that brings about a kind of revolution of consciousness, almost in the way that we think about class consciousness. The day when you finally realize, like, oh, I'm the one being exploited here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
For Deleuze, it's more multifarious than that. And I would say it includes class consciousness within it. But given now with the imminent crisis of the climate and everything else besides, there is a tendency to, feel resigned or to
Absolutely.
feel like we should have done more about this. Another way to sort of read like Nietzsche and Deleuze too is like, well, amor fati, fuck it, libertine. We're just going to fuck everybody and drink Knob Creek whiskey until the end of time, which for Deleuze, I mean, is not the experience that we're talking about. That could also be an expression of resentment in some ways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do we think through Deleuze's lens of his version of amor fati in the face of this imminent global crisis, which you say we might already be within, and that could be a helpful way to understanding Deleuze's ethic.
Yeah, no, definitely. So this is sort of like where I'm trying to intervene, right? In this sort of discussion, because Deleuze never gave a sort of, even though what we were just talking about with the vision of the event and the sort of legacy that we can leave into creativity in writing as some deep political ramifications, potentially, in terms of what, like, we can, how as philosophers or as like university people or like thinkers, what we can do to sort of bring a original contribution to those, to thinking through those things, political problems mostly. But there is no politics of the event really in this stage, at least of the political stuff comes in later, especially when Deleuze meets Guattari and start writing with him. In those two books, Difference in Repetition, Logic of Sense, that were written a year apart, which is prodigious. There's no like actual description of potential politics of what it would look like to sort of bring into this idea that we can understand or have a vision through an encounter of an event. So I can see the event of my own death in this sort of encounter by having a moment of existential crisis and wanting to write about it, change my life, have this sort of moment of clarity and stuff like that. So there's a sort of ethics there that I can myself sort of become a better person with others and stuff. There can be that. Then how do we bring that to the large scale of not my private death, my private eternal recurrence, my private introduction of creative variations into existence, my private amor fati? How can we import that or try to draw a parallel with what it means for collectivity? And now we're talking global scale, all human beings, all animal species, many different forms of life coming to an end through making the earth inhabitable, right? So one thing that I'm trying to argue in this paper that I was presenting the other day is, firstly, death, my own private death as an event, has always already occurred in this sense that it's sort of always traversing pathways of my life, and I always sort of encounter it into those moments of disruptions. The same way extinction, especially in this context that we're in, has already happened in a sense, because we're seeing its effectuations in the world. And it's by encountering, I think, those effectuations, not only as a process leading to an extinction that would be only happen in fact once it happens, once everybody is dead, but precisely seeing them as total expression of absolute extinction. So registering a massive temperature discrepancy in Europe for a summer, the forest fires in Canada last summer, those effectuations of the event, seeing them like the mortal wound of the soldier, like something that crystallizes a system of forces that can be traced back in a sort of counter-effectuation, in a sort of trial of the event, in a sort of clear vision in which we can see all of the suddenly through the forest fire, seeing all of the micro effectuations that led there, seeing all the fossil fuel exploitation, seeing all the different economic interests, it's a sort of impossible attempt at thinking everything all at the same time, but being faced with those effectuations of the event, of extinction, as propellers, as those, what Deleuze calls a dark precursor,
right.
A sort of evil genius that sets you on the path of thought, and that sets you on the path of restlessness of thought too. So it's sort of how I would try to envision it, to think about it, like this sort of call for collective reflection that is not about resignation. We don't do anything about it because it's over already. Not resentment. This is the corporation. This is the individual trying to point fingers at just don't buy plastic straws. That's your problem. Or like, I will buy so many plastic straws because it's not my fault. It's a corporation. Like,
right.
Sort of like,
yeah, screw those guys.
Sometimes I tend to do the latter.
We all have our own version of that. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So instead, those are figures of resentment because it's always pointing fingers not at the event itself, but at like empirical actors in the world, which are basically just manifestations of the event themselves. So,
there's an experience I'm sure we've all had, if you've been on social media, where every now and again on the timeline, that graph comes up that shows you the rise in global sea level temperatures, or, hey, this was the hottest summer ever, And for me, it's almost like getting a zombie bite. You're bit, but you hide the bite.
Yes.
And that is a kind of, that sort of echoes what we're saying about resentment in some sense, because that's a privatization of one's wound.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the question is, what is the alternative to, of course, in the zombie bite world, and this is the reactionary nature of zombie films, is that you have to die. Then, there is no solution at that point. But like what on Deleuze's terms is everybody sort of, and this is kind of a battalion thing. How do we put our climate change zombie bites together?
That's so interesting because I think like I'm just thinking about it because of what you were saying with the zombie bite, but it also makes me think of like the whole discussion about eco-anxiety that is sort of like a little bit fading these days. But like in like 2022, there was this whole sort of thing of like, oh, the youth has eco-anxiety. We're sort of all panicking. In a sense, there's a whole sort of individualistic libertarian sort of way of like living eco-anxiety as this sort of private wound that I have. This concerns me, this concerns my children, this concerns so there's a way of privatizing it, and then is something like, oh, let's do something because we're all affected deeply, and like making it a collective effort. Is there a way basically to talk about this felt sense of anxiety and felt sense of like doom and urgency that would serve a collective vision of the event rather than a individualistic vision of my children will probably have a hard time in the world.
Well, that's something for us to think about for another time. Ben, I just want to thank you. This is an amazing discussion. We've had these amazing discussions now in passing over the period of months. That is
true. So. Now we have it on record.
Exactly. It's in the memory.
It's in the memory, exactly.
Yeah. And so just want to say thanks, and we'll have you back again sometime.
Thank you so much for inviting me. That was amazing in the dome again.
Yeah. All right.